All right, so it looks like we have our official group, so we will begin. That's how I can see on the audio tape of the audio recording of where to cut all the pre-chatter from the recording. So, we are now in Parashah.
Reeh.
Exactly. And we're continuing with Moses' farewell address and his continued exhortations, his instructions and admonitions to the nation of Israel as they are about to cross the Jordan River and go into the land. And things, he knows, are going to be a little different than they have been. But sometimes we lose sight of what all those differences are going to be. Some of them you can probably imagine or have already read about. What are some of the differences between when we were in Sinai and once we go into the land? What's going to change?
And I have to work.
Okay, so first of all, there's going to be work. And work for a number of different things. The most famous, of course, is they're going to have to get work for food. Because what have we been living off for the last 40 years?
Manna.
Manna, exactly, with the occasional quail thrown in to make us sick. In addition from that, we're also going to have to work for clothes. The Torah says that our clothes did not wear out during the time that we were there in the wilderness. So that's probably going to be a big change. Any other differences?
The moving around.
Oh, well, moving around, exactly.
Settling?
So, what's that?
Settling?
We will settle the land, which has a number of different facets to it. One of the things means is that we're not going to be moving from site to site quite the same way, because we are going to be, well, dividing the land. We're coming to the point of the allotments, of which part of the land is going to Judah, which part is going to Naphtali, which part is going to Gad, and all of those sorts of things. So the land's going to be divided, and the tribes will begin to settle in their divisions, rather than all being one giant camp, as it has been during the wandering in quotes, in the wilderness. Anything else that's going to change once we settle down?
Don't have to fight.
What's that?
Don't have to fight.
Well, theoretically, once we settle, there'll be no fighting. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen.
No, I mean in order to settle the land.
Oh, you mean we'll have to fight?
Yes.
Yes. Well, interestingly, we have been fighting during our time in the desert. We had to fight against the different nations that we tried to pass through or that we were coming close to, so they came out to attack us. So we have been struggling quite a bit during our Sinai time. Theoretically, once we settle the land, that's supposed to be done. As we're going to see, we're supposed to have peace in the land. But there are very few periods in Jewish history during our time in the land of Israel where we are actually at peace, where we are not under threat from some other outside force. So there is both the promise of fighting to conquest and resting after that, and all of that gets, as we're going to see, a little bit off schedule. Anything else going to change when we settle down?
Going to have to build the trains.
Going to have to what?
Build the trains.
Build
latrines.
Build latrines. You mean build a privy.
Yeah.
Well, we've been building those as we've been going along too. I mean, you need a place to do your business in the desert.
There's always, they were commanded when they went out to fight from the camp to take a trowel with them.
Yes, so it was a more personal matter, we might say, during the time in Sinai. Now, of course, you'll be building them as a permanent part of our homes and of our towns. Absolutely, we'll leave that under the settled rubric. There are also a host of mitzvot that are going to kick into effect. For example, the laws of the first fruit offerings. We weren't doing that when we were out in the wilderness. We didn't have fields and orchards to produce first fruits from, so no offering was possible from them. Additionally, the laws requiring the land to rest, the sabbatical, is going to kick in. We didn't have to worry about not mowing. Speaking like a suburbanite, not plowing the land when we were out in the wilderness, because that wasn't the style of living.
We didn't live in one.
And it wasn't land subject to the mitzvah of the sabbatical release. Very important. We talked a number of weeks ago now about the different borders of the land of Israel, and the laws requiring the sabbatical and jubilee resting of the land only apply to the land of Israel as a mitzvah. It's a good idea elsewhere too, but as far as being a commandment, it only applies in the borders of Israel. And so even if we had wanted to, it wouldn't have been a commandment to let the land rest while we were in Sinai. So there are a number of things, go ahead and put that there, that are going to kick in. But we tend to have this impression that once we get into the land of Israel, that's when we are going to get even more focused, more down to the nitty-gritty, more observant of the commandments. What we're doing now is kind of this childhood period where we are being coddled with the occasional spanking by God. But when we get into Israel, that's when we're going to grow up and really will be responsible for all of these things. But we're going to look at a topic today that probably is completely unfamiliar to all of you, at least that's my guess, and see that it's not always so. But at least in one particular way, things actually became more lenient, come as you are, once we crossed the border than they had been before. We'll just have to keep our eyes open for that. So we're going to look in chapter 12 of the book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim. This is from Parashah Reeh. Let's see. Who hasn't read in a while?
That was great.
What?
That was very pleasant.
Well, I don't want you to feel that you always have to shoulder the burden. And I don't want anyone else to feel that they can always just sit back and, let Sandy volunteer because they don't have to feel that they're responsible for reading.
I'll read if nobody else wants.
Okay, start us off. Chapter 12.
Beginning of chapter 12.
Beginning of chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 1.
These are the laws and rules that you must carefully observe in the land that the Lord God of your fathers is giving you to possess as long as you live on earth. You must destroy all the sites at which the nations you are to dispossess worshipped their gods, whether on lofty mountains and on hills or under any luxuriant tree. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, put their sacred posts to the fire, and cut down the images of their gods, obliterating their name from that site. Okay, now this wasn't a mitzvah outside of the land of Israel. When we were walking through Sinai, when we passed by Moab and Edom and Ammon and all these other places, we were required to destroy all of their idols. When we enter the land, however, the idolatrous places of worship are going to need to be torn down. So this is one of the acts of making the land ours that was very important for that first generation entering. Questions, comments, observations?
So far, there's a symmetry with the first commandment.
Mm-hmm. I'm the Lord your God, and no one else is, so...
And here, this encompasses that first command.
Mm-hmm.
Again, reiterating the importance.
Correct. Okay, let's see how we go on, though.
Do not worship the Lord your God in like manner, but look only to the site that the Lord your God will choose amidst all your tribes as his habitation, to establish his name there. There you are to go, and there you are to bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes and contributions, your votive and freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and flocks. Together with your households you shall feast there before the Lord your God, happy in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you.
Okay, so I want to do a quick summary, because sometimes the wording can be a little cumbersome to modern ears, although it's meant to be very precise. What are we going to do with regards to sacrifices when we get there? What's the contrast between us and them? We're not doing like them, we're doing it differently. What's the contrast that's being put out between these two paragraphs? What's that?
1/10 from your
The
your
tithes,
mom.
right? Mm-hmm. But how are we, from the first paragraph that we read, which was verses 1 through 3, we then turn to verses 4 through what we just finished, which was 7. It says, do not worship the Lord your God in like manner. Well, what is the difference between how we're going to worship God from the way the Canaanites were worshiping their gods? What is the contrast between that first paragraph and the second paragraph that makes that bridge sentence of don't do like them, but do this instead?
Aside from the details that were not given of how the Canaanites worshipped at the trees and mountains and whatnot.
But you've already got the most important detail that is being mentioned.
They worshipped on every tree, hill, and mountain.
Exactly. Every place was the Canaanite way. If the Canaanites found a nice hill, they'd stick up an altar and they would worship either the god of the hill or Baal or whoever they felt like on that hill. If they found a really impressive tree, they would worship, Asherah or the other divinities at that tree. Or if they didn't have a nice tree convenient, they'd make a big post as an artificial tree. They had artificial trees even back then, and they would worship at that post as a symbolic of a tree. So they would worship anywhere, higgledy-piggledy, come as you are, no problem. And we, in contrast,
Fixed place.
a fixed place.
Chosen by God.
Exactly. But look only to the site your Lord your God will choose amidst all your tribes as his habitation to establish his name there. One and only one. The Canaanites worship wherever they felt like,
And many gods.
and many gods. And we are going to worship one and only one God in one and only one place. Major difference, right? In fact, if we continue reading, we'll see that there might even be a reinforcement to that.
You shall not act at all as we now act here, every man as he pleases, because you have not yet come to the allotted haven that the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross the Jordan and settle in the land that the Lord your God is allotting to you, and he grants you safety from all your enemies around you, and you live in security, then you must bring everything that I command you to the site where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. Your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes and contributions, and all the choice votive offerings that you vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God with your sons and daughters, and with your male and female slaves, along with the Levite in your settlements, for he has no territorial allotment among you.
Okay, go ahead.
Who's talking?
Who's
This is
talking?
not God talking.
Well,
I mean,
that's a deep theological question. This is Moses quoted.
Okay, it's on you.
Presumably in the Torah, what Moses is saying has the approval of God. Moses isn't making
This is what
new stuff
Moses
up.
is saying in behalf of God.
Exactly. So he is making sure we understand what God wants of us, and presumably, from the core theology, Moses knows better than anyone what God wants of us. So his statements are considered to be divinely sanctioned. No lightning bolts came down and hit him, so apparently he knew what he was talking about. So again, we have an idea. We are going to worship God in one and only one place. But we have a different contrast at the start of that last paragraph, in verse 8.
Don't act as we do here and now.
Well, where's here and now in this context? Where's Moses speaking from?
East of the Jordan.
East of the Jordan, on the other side of the Jordan, which means outside of Israel, which means before the conquest, before the settling of the land. So it appears that the every place, wherever you felt like opposite of the one and only that was the Canaanite model, there is also an opposite Israel model, or Israelite model, that existed before they entered the land. And that model would seem to be, what's the phrase that's used?
Every man is right in his own eyes.
Every man is right in his own eyes. Whatever seems right to you is fine. Apparently, at least from what we call the Peshat, from the simplest reading of the text, from our most intuitive, non-reflective investigation of the text, but just how it reads the first time through, pre-Israel seems to be similar to the current Canaanite practice. Before we go into Israel, apparently we're doing whatever we feel like. Notice a few perplexed looks, because that seems to cause another problem.
But God was leading the people to various places, and then they stopped and set up the Mishkan tabernacle.
Oops, forgot my H. But what about the Mishkan? Because we had all those chapters way back in the book of Exodus talking about building the Mishkan. We had all those chapters in the book of Bamidbar talking about how it was being moved. And we got all those chapters in Leviticus talking about how the sacrifices were performed and its dedication and all of that. For the past 38 years since the Mishkan was finished being built, they've been worshiping at the Mishkan. Not wherever they felt like.
Why they say you shall act not as we act, every day as he pleases.
And exactly, for those who couldn't hear, because Mike was sort of mumbling over there,
I'm sorry.
that's okay. I just want to make sure everyone hears it because it is the question du jour, the question of the day. Why in the world does the verse say that everyone acted as they felt like, when for the last 38 years, according to the narrative, we had in fact only been worshiping at the Mishkan, which is exactly the opposite of every man as he pleases, and is precisely the model that we are hoping to achieve when we enter the land of Israel, which is there being one and only one place to worship. It's not as though people were running around all the Sinai Peninsula making sacrifices on any mountain they felt like. Everybody went to the Mishkan. So how can this possibly be contrasted? That's what we're going to wrestle with. Are we good and confused? Good! As I say, confusion is the birthplace of understanding. Because if you're not confused, you're not ready to hear something different than you already thought. If you're confused, then you're open to a new possibility of understanding. All right. Just I want to take care, and why don't you go ahead and finish off for us, if you could, Judy, from verse 13 through 16.
Take care not to sacrifice your burnt offerings in any place you like, but only in the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribal territories. There you shall sacrifice your burnt offerings, and there you shall observe all that I enjoin upon you. But whenever you desire, you may slaughter and eat meat in any of your settlements, according to the blessing that the Lord your God has granted you. The impure and the pure alike may partake of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. But you must not partake of the blood. You shall pour it out on the ground like water.
All right, a very interesting part that is giving us at least one out for what's about to happen, and this one and only. This only counts for actual sacrifices, but meat, that can be every place you want. If you're just killing an animal for meat, not as a sacrifice, you can do that wherever you feel like. And you can eat the meat, whether you're pure or impure, unlike a sacrifice where you must be ritually pure. And you can eat the meat of other kosher animals that normally are not normally, but are never offered on the altar, like a deer or a gazelle. Deer and gazelle never make it to the altar of the Mishkan, but they are kosher, and so you can eat them. So they're trying to make a little bit of a distinction here, that you can have meat that isn't a sacrifice. That's a very important concept, and one that probably came a bit as a surprise. The eating of meat was not considered a trivial matter. You didn't normally go around slaughtering animals like this, the large domesticated animals, just for fun and food, because they were fairly expensive and valuable commodities. So you would only eat meat often. For many of the less affluent families, you'd only eat meat on the festival days. When you brought your sacrifice to the Mishkan, or later the temple, and they sacrificed it for Pesach or Shavuot or Sukkot, you'd get to eat meat. But the rest of the year, you probably wouldn't have these domesticated mammal meats. You might have bird and things like that, but maybe fish, but you wouldn't be having lamb or beef during much of the year. So this is a very important aside, but it doesn't quite solve our problem of everybody doing what they feel like, and yet we think we were all in the Mishkan. And we also don't want to do what they do. We only want to have one and only place. So let's go ahead and see how Rashi tries to understand this. It's been a while since we've done a mostly Rashi read. So I thought we should get back and see how he takes these verses apart and reassembles them in a way that makes, at least, we'll hope, a little more sense. Okay, so would like to start off with Rashi? Now, Rashi, you can flip back to our verse 4, which is back on page 1063. And he's going off the phrase where it says, do not worship, in the JPS translation of the Eitz Chaim Chumash. It literally means do not do or do not act in this way. So we're using that as our more literal translation.
Do not act in this way, by bringing burnt offerings for the sake of heaven anywhere except for the place God will select. Another interpretation.
So the first interpretation is what we came up with, right? There's Rashi saying there's a contrast here, and the contrast is between they did it wherever they felt like, we're only going to do it in a specific place. But there's another interpretation to the contrast.
Smash their altars, obliterate their names. Do not act this way. This prohibits erasing the sacred name and breaking an altar stone or a temple courtyard stone.
So he says, but there's another way to understand the contrast, which is don't treat God the way you treat their statues, idols, and temples. Meaning, you're going to smash their stuff, don't smash my stuff, says God. That's the distinction that's being made in those two paragraphs. And indeed, this is where we get the halacha that we don't erase God's name. That if you have a piece of paper that has one of the Hebrew names of God, we don't just crumple it up and throw it in the trash, but we have to place it within the geniza and eventually bury it. And similarly, that were the temple still standing, we wouldn't go around smashing the building blocks of it either.
Rabbi Ishmael said, it is conceivable that an
question, is it conceivable?
Is it conceivable that an Israelite would smash altars?
Meaning of God.
Rather, do not act as they do, whereby your iniquity would cause the ruin of the temple of your forefathers.
So he makes a little bit of a more broader statement of they were following all this idolatry and all of that, and that's why they are having their temples torn down. You should not follow and do as they do, lest your temple be torn down as well, lest God's monument be torn down. Make sense? So we transition a little bit more into a homily, a bit of a preaching here. If you guys do exactly as the Canaanites were doing, your temple is going to get pulled down too. Because that's why theirs got pulled down, because they were this horribly nasty nation of people that were engaged in all sorts of terrible, terrible acts. Idolatry just being the largest catch-all for what went under that umbrella. Make sense? Not too bad? Nothing revolutionary yet, maybe? Okay. Onward. This is from verse 5.
Seek his presence. This refers to the tabernacle at Shiloh.
Okay. What's the tabernacle at Shiloh? We all went there when you were in your tours of Israel, right? You saw that tabernacle? What is it?
That's where they put the Mishkan up. Semi-permanent.
The first.
It is the first semi-permanent. And that's a very important phrase. It's the first semi-permanent location of the Mishkan within Israel.
And there was Samuel, starts out.
There's a whole large section in the book of Samuel about how it got established, and that was at Shiloh was where the tabernacle was, as you can see from the chart on the right, for 369 years. For 369 years, the Mishkan was in Shiloh. That was its semi-permanent location.
Whose territories?
That's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head. I know that it's in the middle of the country, but I can't remember exactly which tribe Shiloh fell under.
I just wonder it's where and why.
That's a whole other discussion.
Okay.
We're going to be taking this in a different direction, although we have someone already looking on the map, which would be great if you could find it. Depends how good your eyesight is.
I don't even know where to start looking.
I
see it
I was going to say, it's in the middle of the country.
Right there.
And according to this, it looks like it's in Ephraim. Which is not surprising. Ephraim was one of the major tribes. What's that?
I said I could have looked at the map. I forgot about it.
Empiricism, is that all you have to offer? Okay, so the tabernacle was semi-put up in Shiloh, but it wasn't put up at Shiloh immediately, according to at least the general read of the book, because initially, even after we crossed the Jordan, we didn't own Shiloh. It hadn't been conquered yet. There were, in fact, 14 years where the tabernacle was installed at Gilgal, which is just on the other side of the Jordan, and was one of the very first areas that we captured with Joshua coming in with Jericho. So the tabernacle was in Gilgal for 14 years. Then it was moved to Shiloh, where it stayed for 369 years. And then we're going to see that it got moved around a little bit after that too. Okay? Okay. Now this is referring to our verse, which is talking about our good confusing verse, "You shall not act as we all now act here, every man as he pleases." Rashi needs to try and help us untangle this. And actually it's based on Sifrei, which is the Midrash collection for the book of Devarim.
When you cross the Yarden,
That's the Jordan River.
you will be immediately permitted to bring up offerings on the personal bama
Which is an altar.
throughout all 14 years of conquest and division. However, on the personal bama altar, you may not offer everything you offer here this day at the Mishkan, which remains with you and has been anointed. This is an appropriate place for bringing sin and guilt offerings and vow and free will offerings. However, on the personal bama, nothing may be offered except for the vow and free will offerings. This is the meaning of each what is upright in his eyes.
Which is a more literal translation of doing as you please.
Vow and free will offerings, which you will donate because you feel it is proper to bring them and not because you must. These you may offer on a personal bama.
Okay. Clear as mud?
Yes.
Okay. So we need to make a few distinctions here. There are some offerings that are obligatory, that we have an obligation to bring, a chiyuv. Oops, I finish off the words, which are, we just read them in Rashi.
Sin and guilt.
Okay. Sin and guilt. These are personal offerings, by the way. Not the national offerings are also an obligation, but they're not my personal obligation. Whereas if I perform various sorts of transgressions, I may have to bring a sin offering or a guilt offering. I am obligated to do so. Once I have recognized my transgression and made repentance for it, I then finish the process by bringing the offering. I'm not doing it because I want to necessarily, although I should, but I'm doing it because I am commanded to. I'm obligated to do so, having transgressed, to bring one of these offerings, depending upon the transgression, but we'll talk about that again when we get back to the book of Leviticus. But there are also other, this pen is dying, voluntary offerings, known as, at least in the English, okay, vow. You can make a vow saying, I hereby dedicate such and such a cow to the temple or to the Mishkan, or free will, which are when you're feeling happy about something and you just want to share it with God or with other people. Celebratory or Thanksgiving type offering, it's whatever you feel like. So both of these are completely voluntary. There's no commandment that you must bring them, or under certain circumstances that you must bring them. However, if you're going to bring them, you have to bring them according to halakha, according to Jewish law. They're still governed by the rules. But what are the rules that Rashi is talking about here for that period of entering the land of Israel? This 14-year window before the Mishkan is put into Shiloh while it's still at Gilgal.
Do it wherever.
Yeah. These voluntary offerings, an individual Israelite could offer up on an altar of their own choosing. They still would need to have someone else to officiate at it if they're not a Kohen. But they would not have to walk all the way to Gilgal with their lamb, goat, or cow, or whatever it might be, to make the sacrifice. They could sacrifice on hills or under trees or any of these other places on an altar of their own making, on their own personal bama, their own personal altar. Surprising? Well, yes. I should hope it's surprising. After all, the book of Deuteronomy repeatedly goes over and over and over and over again only at the place I choose, only at the place I choose, only at the place I establish my name, only at the place I establish my name, and doesn't normally explicitly say, except for a few special years when things are going to be in turmoil, then you get to do it wherever you feel like. Does this seem like a natural read of those verses, though? I mean, if you remember, I had to erase it for the space. Our original read of those verses was saying, you don't get to just do a sacrifice wherever you feel like it. You only get to do it in one and only one place. And now Rashi is saying exactly the opposite. That this verse is saying, unlike now, where you only can sacrifice at the Mishkan, when you cross over the Jordan, you will be able to sacrifice these voluntary offerings wherever it is right in your own eyes.
This is only for the 14 years.
That's what Rashi is saying.
In Gilgal.
Correct. Although there's going to be a second period where this is permissible as well. But initially just the first 14.
Well,
Is that number relevant in some way?
The specific number 14? Not that I've ever
7
heard.
plus 7 or...
Not that I've ever heard specifically. I mean, 14 is always nice because it spells the word Yad. But I've never heard the number 14 as being especially important. The importance was that this was the period that was between the crossing of the Jordan and the settling of the land, the more firm conquest of the land and the apportionment of the land. It was that window between those major events. We cross, and then we finish the settling process, or at least primary phase of the settling and apportionment process. And during that window, we have this special dispensation to offer these voluntary offerings wherever we feel like it.
That's so curious.
So curious, isn't it?
Yes.
Isn't it? And does it fit that verse?
well, when in verse 10, when it says that he will grant you safety from all your enemies around you and you will live in security, there's kind of the notion that you're coming to this land and God's going to protect it. So wherever you are, you're kind of going to be on holy land. So it would kind of make a little sense that, since you don't have to worry about your enemies coming in and defiling the place, wherever you are is going to kind of be considered holy in God's land. So you can do it wherever you are.
Okay, let's get to that section. By the way, that list of verses from Genesis, these are all examples of Noah, of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob creating their own altars. If you remember when we read through the book of Genesis, it seems like everywhere the patriarchs go, they're dropping stones and sacrificing animals. Well, this appears to be a continuation of that process, which had been in abeyance for a while. They hadn't been doing this for a while, certainly not down in Egypt, where they told Pharaoh they had to go out into the wilderness to worship God. But now, apparently, we're going to be able to start building our own altars again, our own bamot. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the Rashi for verse 9, which is going to lead us through into 10. There's sort of it's what we called in rabbinic school a read-through Rashi, which means he is essentially taking the words of the verse, breaking them apart, and then adding new bits of sentence in between them. So, for example, if you'll let me go ahead and take verse 9 for you on the front.
All right.
For you will not have come, this is from verse 9, where it says, because you have not yet come to the allotted haven the Lord your God is giving you, for you will not have come throughout those 14 years, as yet, meaning until now, but he's saying not until now, but until then, as a yet, to the rest, which is the word that they're translating as haven. But what they did is they took, the problem is they took two words and kind of broke it into one. It says El HaMenucha, to the rest, the El HaNachala, and to the inheritance. And what the JPS did is say allotted haven, rather than saying to the rest and to the inheritance. They took the word inheritance and made it an adjective to modify the word haven. I disagree with JPS, which is why I put it back into more of the literal Hebrew. So you will not have come throughout the 14 years, yet to the rest, that is to say Shiloh, or the inheritance, that is to say Jerusalem. meaning you have this special dispensation because for at least 14 years you won't have Shiloh.
Could you repeat allotted haven?
Yep.
You read it as.
So the allotted haven is better read as the place of rest and the inheritance, or the
Right.
the heritage would also be another way of translating Nachala.
As my Presbyterian version has it that way.
Has which way?
Your way.
Okay, more broken into two.
The resting place
Yep.
and the inheritance.
Yep.
Right.
So that's a slightly more literal translation, which JPS doesn't use, of course, because the basic sense of it, at least on a surface reading, is that it's your allotted place of rest. They are sort of smoothing out the textual difficulties to make it easier to read. Unfortunately, when they smooth it out, they make it so that it's harder to find the things to ask questions about, which is, why are they using these two separate words? Well, Rashi tells us they're using two separate words because it's actually talking about two separate places, meaning this haven, that refers to Shiloh, and your inheritance, that refers to Jerusalem. And as long as you have one or the other of those, you don't get to do your bamot, your altars, wherever you feel like. But until you do get to build your altars wherever you feel like.
Does it matter when God actually designated Shiloh as the place? To your argument?
Does it matter when he designated that Shiloh would be it, or when Shiloh became secure enough to be it?
No, my question is, when did God actually designate Shiloh as the resting place?
He says, so could Shiloh conceivably be that inheritance?
Even before we had conquered it. No, the question is, should Shiloh achieve the status as being one of the semi-permanent resting places of the Mishkan, where when the Mishkan is there, all other altars become illegitimate, as a title in advance of its establishment, or only once it was established? According, of course, to the Torah's view, it was always anticipated that Shiloh would be one of those places, what with God knowing the future and all, it's handy, but it didn't achieve that status and didn't delegitimize the other altars until it was actually established.
I would, as a lawyer by training, a resting place is something present, and inheritance is always a future interest. So when you say resting and inheritance, you're talking about your present and the future.
Right, although in the particular time Moses
creates a distinction in time.
But at the particular time that Moses is talking here, neither one were available in the present.
So we're talking about the nearer future and the farther future.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Right.
You can say the nearer future and the farther future. Yes, the more immediate resting place is going to be Shiloh, and then the more permanent resting place is going to be Jerusalem.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay. So, which takes us to the back page.
That's another thought.
Okay.
The Hebrew word that you're translating as rest or resting place.
Mm-hmm. El HaMenucha, yes.
Yeah, is it necessarily place? Because the way with the English translation to your rest could refer to cessation of war.
So the word menucha generally can just mean rest. But when you have the preposition el hamenucha, it has an implication that you are going to the rest. Rest not meaning leftover rest, but the rest meaning like the tranquil resting place.
Yeah.
So yes, it could mean both rest that we enjoy on Shabbat every week, and we wish each other to have menucha every week for Shabbat, to have that restful experience. Or it can mean, especially with the preposition el, which means going to it, and with the definite article ha, meaning that it's the rest, more of an intention, more of a feeling of a designated location, especially in context where it's saying you will have a particular place, that God is going to choose a place. And it feels, and you're right, that it's definitely something that can be discussed, but it feels more like we're talking about a place than just a status, than just resting, but more the place of rest. But that's something we can definitely discuss. I would, of course, argue further that we very rarely, as we mentioned at the beginning, had rest. But there were times for 369 years where the Mishkan was at rest, even though the nation wasn't. The nation was still struggling, fighting, and all of that, but the Mishkan wasn't moving around for those 369 years. So it was at rest even when we weren't.
Okay.
So it was its resting place, even though the mood of the nation was not restful by any stretch of the imagination.
I just thought that maybe with the two separate words, it meant rest from having war and the specific location where...
Well, I mean, that certainly would be an alternative, although, again, I'm not entirely convinced, but it would be an alternative solution to this same problem, which is, if God is picking only one place, why does he say two, meaning the preposition to, two places? Because God says, I'm going to have a place, and then he says it's going to be the rest, and it's going to be the inheritance. Well, that sounds like two places, which is part of what Rashi's trying to untangle here. That, yes, it is going to be two places. The first is Shiloh, the next is Jerusalem, and they are sequential, singular places. It's sort of the equivalent of being a serial monogamist. That, yes, you've had multiple spouses, but not at the same time. Just sequentially. So you've only ever been married to one person at a time. Similarly, there was only ever one place at a time that God had chosen to make his name known, or name to rest is the phrase. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't another one that came later. Just one at a time, as opposed to one and only forever. Okay? Maybe? A little confusion is okay, but as long as we basically understand the point, we can at least move on and see how much we really like it. Okay, so we come in verse 10 to this wonderful thing that Natasha was pointing out, where it says, and he grants you safety from all your enemies around you, and you live in security. And Rashi goes on to say, after the conquest and division, the peace with the nations whom Adonai allowed to remain in order to test Israel, this did not occur until the time of David. Then and only then, once David came along and gave us peace from all the nations that surrounded us still, then let it be that place. Build for yourselves the chosen sanctuary in Jerusalem. This is as it is said concerning David. It was when, this is from the book of Samuel, it was when the king had settled in his palace and Adonai had granted him peace on every side from all his enemies. Sounds very similar to what we're just reading here. Then the king said to the prophet Nathan, look here, I am settled in a palace of cedar wood while the ark of God languishes amidst curtains, referring to the tent nature of the Mishkan. I've got this wonderful wooden and stone palace, and he's stuck out there in canvas.
What part of Samuel is that from?
Book 1. I can't tell you the chapter off the top of my head.
Helping co-teach that in a few weeks.
It's a good book to keep rereading anyway. So.
I know, it's good right now.
So the idea here is that Shiloh was the semi-permanent location for 369 years, but it was only semi-permanent because the true location would only be selected once we were truly at peace. And that didn't occur until David finished the process of subduing all of the major enemies around us, at least the major enemies that were occupying the land of Israel itself. There were still surrounding hostilities, but Israel itself became pacified, and then we only had to worry about foreign invaders once David had become king. He finally destroyed the Philistines, who were the last real threat. Doing okay with that? Okay, so now we know why Jerusalem was always held as being the ultimate resting place of the Mishkan, and then later the temple to be built, but it was just being reserved, just as our verse said, when you cross the Jordan and set on the land the Lord your God is allotting you, and he grants you safety from all your enemies and around you, and you live in security, then you must bring everything that I command you to the site where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. Meaning then and only then. But prior to that, there's going to be a little more flexibility. How are we doing? Okay. So it is there that you shall bring The discussion above, meaning the first few Rashi comments we read, concerns Shiloh, while the discussion here concerns Jerusalem. And this is why Scripture separates them by granting permission between them. From the time that Shiloh was laid waste and they arrived at Nov, and Nov was laid waste and they arrived at Gibeon, personal bamot were permitted until they arrived at Jerusalem. So he's pointing out that there was this window of opportunity again, you can see on our chart on the first page, of about 57 years, when Nov and Gibeon were the less than semi-permanent resting places of the Mishkan that were being moved depending upon the fortunes of war, of how well we were doing against our enemies. And therefore, during that window, again, personal bamot, these personal altars were permitted. But then once Jerusalem was established, no more personal bamot, and, interestingly, and very important for the continuation of Judaism, never to be permitted again. Ever. Which is why we don't offer up sheep in Orlando. And why you don't offer up sheep in Tel Aviv, even for that matter. Even if you were going to try and say it should be limited to the land of Israel, although we offered plenty in Sinai, we apparently reached the threshold once the name had chosen to be established permanently with Jerusalem, that we were now prohibited from offering sacrifices at any other location, at any other altar, personal or national. The Mishkan was not going to be relocated again, and the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was not going to be rebuilt in any other location. It was Jerusalem or nothing. And it's been nothing for almost 2,000 years. How are we doing? Okay, so what have we learned? Apart from things that are a little bit more complicated than we often think. Apart from the fact that reading that wonderful verse 8 can be read in a way that might flip it on its head. You shall not act at all as we act now here, meaning you don't have to bring your voluntary offerings to the Mishkan, but instead, every man shall do as he pleases. You'll be able to offer your sacrifices anywhere, is how the Midrash is rereading that verse. Because, after all, you have not yet come to the allotted haven that the Lord your God is giving you. But when you do settle in the land and the Lord your God is allotting you and he grants you safety from all your enemies around you and you live in security, then you have to bring everything to the place that he has chosen. So right now you have to bring everything to the Mishkan, but once we cross over, you'll be able to do as you like with regards to your voluntary offerings. But once God's giving you security and makes it clear where you're supposed to establish, then you have to bring everything to that new place. A little different than our first reading.
Yeah.
But can you see that it reconciles some of the problems we had with that first reading? Even though the first reading was easier on the grammar, easier on where the verses break according to the more modern convention of numbering, which remember is a later addition. God did not give the Torah with verse numbers. It caused us big problems for the historical narrative, which was prior to this speech, everything we'd seen was that people had to bring offerings to one and only one place. So how could Moses be saying that we were doing what we felt like? And so instead of saying, do as you please as being a description of the past, do as you please as a description of the forthcoming temporary permission.
Short-term future.
Short-term future, the near future. In the near future, you're going to have new permission. And that new permission will only be revoked once we have security. With the first phase of which is going to be 14 years from now, we know now from history. And then once that security gets destroyed, there's going to be a temporary period where you can do what you feel like again. And then once we have the true security and peace that will be established by King David, then we are in business with one and only location. No more franchises.
Well, through the reading of this, I was reminded how when God said His commandments were not grievous, He always makes exception when it's impossible.
God never commands us to do anything that's impossible.
It mentions in here
Yes.
that if you live so far away from Jerusalem
Correct.
that you can't carry your you can sell it, take the
proceeds and
proceeds,
carry
and
it.
buy it there.
Exactly, because carrying a few coins is a lot easier than carrying a cow.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if you can't afford it,
And if you can't afford the bull, you afford the sheep. If you can't afford the sheep, you can afford the birds. Exactly. And in some cases, even if you can't afford the birds, you can afford grain.
But that doesn't change the fact that it's Jerusalem.
In that particular, yes.
Yeah.
But however, here, it seems to be that if the land doesn't have even a measure of security, then God is willing to allow these voluntary offerings.
It's a voluntary offering.
The voluntary offerings.
Right, not the obligatory offering.
Oh, okay, which brings us to
It's different.
which brings us to our application, which
Different.
is voluntary offerings. What do we do for offerings now? I mean, we just described, we just said very clearly, no altar in Jerusalem, no temple, means no offerings. But God told us to bring offerings. So what are we doing now for the obligatory offerings?
Pray.
Pray. Exactly. Very famously, Rabbinic Judaism said that prayer can substitute for an offering. And as such, we pray at the times of the offerings. The morning prayers, the afternoon prayer, and the evening prayers are each pegged to a particular phase of the sacrificial service. But those count for only the obligatory offerings. How then do we make a voluntary offering in the modern world? Well, luckily Rambam has summarized that for us. Who would like to read a little Rambam at the middle on the back page? All right.
It is there that you shall bring.
Oh, nope,
Oh, no,
from the middle.
3 prayers.
3 prayers.
3 prayers are recited daily: the evening prayer, the morning prayer, and the minchah prayer. There are 4 on Sabbaths, festivals, and Rosh Chodesh. The 3 that are recited daily in the Musaf prayer. On Yom Kippur, there are 5. These 4 and the Ne'ilah prayer.
All right, now when we say prayer, what do we mean by prayer? It's just, God, please let me pass this test? God, please let me win the lottery? Is that what we mean by prayer?
Sounds like the specific services.
A very specific part of the service, in fact. The Amidah. Well done, Sandy. The Amidah, or the Amidah in common parlance. The Amidah. That set of prayers that we stand up for. Amidah means standing. For in the middle of the Shacharit, the culmination of the Shacharit service, the morning service, as well as on Shabbat, the Musaf service, which is the part of the service that we do right after the Devar Torah here, the sermon. Those standing prayers, those Amidot, the reason why we do 2 of them, even though they are so close to each other and even very similar in terminology, because as we're going to see, the first 3 and last 3 prayers never change. The reason we do 2 of them so close to each other is because we need to fulfill the obligatory daily prayers that would have been offered as sacrifices in the ancient world. We're not just doing those prayers because we like to, although some of us do. We're not doing those prayers because we think it's fun or instructive, although they can be fun and they can be instructive. We're doing them because we are obligated to do them. And we are fulfilling the obligation of the sacrifices in the only way we can, which is through prayer. Which comes back to the question then, when do I get to do a voluntary prayer? When do I get to give my own voluntary offering, my own voluntary Amidah?
You do it in the Amidah.
What's that?
I do it in the Amidah.
Well, we're going to see what you do and what you don't do. So, giving your own spin to the prayer, making your own petition, your own reflection, your own praise of God, whatever it might be, during the Amidot, during the prayers that we do for Shachar, pointing to here, for the obligation, for the morning, for the afternoon, for the Musaf, the additional, or for the evening, that doesn't count as voluntary, because you are commanded to do those. Even though you can change them a bit, and you can add your own feeling, you can give your own sense to it, you can even increase what you were talking about and expand upon the themes of those prayers, the basic unit of the Amidah is fulfilling an obligation. It's a duty. And doing your duty, even doing your duty better than expected, is still just doing your duty. That's not voluntary. You know, if your job is to cut out all of the tickets for high holidays, like Michelle Edner, our office assistant, it's her job to cut out all those tickets. When she does it, and she does it well, she has done her duty. She's fulfilled her obligation. However, when we have volunteers that come in to help, even though they're doing exactly the same job, because it's not their obligation, they are doing something exceptional. They are voluntarily doing what isn't their duty. Correct?
Yes.
You have workers for the county that are cleaning up the side of the road, and on the other side of the road you have a voluntary organization that's helping clean up the side of the road. They're both cleaning up the road, but one is doing it because it's their duty, and one's doing it because it's voluntary. So how do we make a voluntary offering? Now, luckily, Rambam will tell us.
The number of these prayers may not be diminished, but may be increased.
Meaning you can't get away with just one Amidah for the day. But if you've done 3 for a weekday, or 4 on Shabbat, or 5 on Yom Kippur, you can always add another Amidah.
If a person wants to pray all day long, he may. Any prayer that one adds is considered as a free will offering.
And again, by prayer, we are talking about the whole Amidah. From the Avot, the Baruch Atah Adonai, although there are different melodies for different days of the week and different holidays, but that's the one you're probably most familiar with, all the way through to the end of Sim Shalom, or Shalom Rav in the evening. That is considered a free will offering.
This is not talking about adding a bracha to the middle bracha.
No, we're going to talk about that in just a second. But when we're talking about adding a prayer, what they mean here by tefillah, what Rambam means by tefillah in context, is the whole Amidah, a unit of an Amidah. An Amidah counts as an animal sacrifice. And so once you've done the minimum required for that day, if you do an additional Amidah, you are giving, just as you would at the temple, a voluntary offering. You're doing more than your duty.
Therefore, one must add a new idea consistent with that blessing in each of the middle blessings. Making an addition of a new concept, even in only one blessing, is sufficient in order to make known that this is a voluntary prayer and not obligatory. In the first 3 and the last 3, one must never add, detract, or change anything at all.
Okay, so we've talked before a little bit about the Amidah. The Amidah has 3 prayers at the beginning and 3 at the end, which never change. And then on Shabbat and other holidays, there's one mega prayer that goes in the middle, one mega blessing that goes in the middle. And on all the other days, that's wrong, there are 13, that go in the middle. 13 separate small blessings. And what Rambam is saying is, if you'd like to add a whole voluntary Amidah, that's great, but during the 13 little parts, or even just one would be sufficient. You have to add something new and different from what you did during your obligatory prayer. So you woke up and you did Shachri, and you did Mincha in the afternoon, and you did Mariv in the evening, or you did Mariv the evening before. We should start where the day starts. So now you finished Mincha, the afternoon prayer, and you want to do a voluntary offering. You want to do this free will offering. Great, but it can't be a duplicate of what you've already done. Because if you just duplicate everything that you've already said, how can you tell the difference between this being an obligatory prayer and a free will prayer? You have to add something unique, preferably to all of the 13 blessings in the middle. So when you're talking about, please God, give us wisdom, you need to make a reference to something specific, some form of wisdom. When you're talking about, please God, heal those that are sick, asking for special healing for a particular person that you hadn't mentioned prior. would be a way to make it unique. When you're asking for a restoration of justice, maybe there's a particular injustice that you would like for God to help remedy in the world. Something that you do and mention differently is what transforms this from just being a duplicate of an obligation into being a free will offering. Finish it up.
The community should not recite a voluntary prayer, since the community does not bring a free will offering. Even an individual should not recite the Musaf prayer twice. Once is the obligation of the day and the other is a voluntary prayer, because the additional offering is never a free will offering.
So we never brought a free will Musaf offering. So you can't do a duplicate Musaf and call it a free will offering. And similarly, the community itself could never dedicate a free will offering. That was something individuals alone did. So your rabbi, you can all breathe a sigh of relief, can't tell you, we are all going to meet here every day for an additional prayer session. I can't command that, because the community can't dedicate a free will offering. Only individuals can.
It's not free will.
And it is not free will, right? And the community, unlike some corporate law in America, the community does not count as an individual. Corporations, as far as corporate bodies of people, are not people. They're not single individuals. They are still individuals. So we are left with, if you have done your duty, you can do another Amidah if you like, and that counts as a free will offering. That counts the same as if you brought a goat to the altar in Jerusalem and said, I want to offer and share this to show my appreciation, my thanks, or my dedication to God. So even though we don't have the opportunity to set up altars wherever we feel like, even though that window of opportunity for sacrificing lambs as a free will offering wherever we felt like has gone, and has been gone for thousands of years, we do still have a way to show a voluntary dedication and a voluntary celebration of our connection to God. The Amidah is not too long. Of course, you have to do your duty first. If you're not doing your duty yet, that's a good place to start.
Going back for a moment to the personal
Bamot, the personal altars.
I want to say bima, and it's not coming out right. Bamot. And when we were allowed to set up any place, and then when we got to Jerusalem, no longer.
Right.
In present time.
Correct.
When we didn't have Jerusalem back in the 40s.
Right.
When Jordan had it.
Correct.
What happened? How did we were not in,
we were not allowed to go into the old city. Correct.
Right. So how did the Jewish people handle the prayers, setting it up in a certain place and only doing it? Those were our synagogues and our temples.
Absolutely. You know, and you know, that really is the mirror of how it began. You know, we began the system of personal prayer in response to the destruction of the first temple.
Right.
When we no longer had a temple where services and sacrifices could take place, our individual communities scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire had to fill in the difference. And they took much of the psalms and the wording that was used by the Levites and Kohanim in Jerusalem and adapted it to a communal setting in what became synagogues. They weren't called that yet, because synagogue is a Greek word, and we weren't under the influence of Greeks yet. But they put together these community centers to have a way of worshiping and connecting to God in a distant place and far from the altars of Jerusalem that have been destroyed. In the modern time, we've had to, for the last 2,000 years, we've had to continually do that. And that is exactly what we have done with synagogues for the last 2,000 years. We have made an institutional, alternative, in quote, altar that never forgot that it was an alternative. So one of the difficulties is that if you create an alternative, it's very easy to forget what it's an alternative to, which in our case is Jerusalem. And it would be very easy to simply say Jerusalem is not important because we've got a synagogue. But Judaism never did that. Judaism always said our synagogue, our prayers, everything we're doing is still connected to there. And we never forgot Jerusalem. We never forgot that what we were doing was a substitute, a very good substitute, and one that I think is very powerful, and there's a reason why it continued even when the Second Temple was restored. But we never forgot that it was about that place.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why we returned to that place, rather than going to Uganda or Argentina or all the other places we could have gone in large numbers to establish an alternative Jewish homeland. We knew where home was. We knew where it was.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Great. Thank you so much for coming today, and I will see you all hopefully on Shabbat, if not some of you in the office prior to that, since you guys seem to hang out here a lot.